But welcome to our final webinar this year. We're going to be talking all things QRA. Myself and Wes Cadby hosting this morning with you for a couple of hours, so welcome wherever you're joining us from. Really excited for this one. So got 4 speakers for you today. We're talking about using quantitative risk analysis to support decision making. I'm going to explore various uses, and we've got some really great topics from pitfalls of sensitivity analysis, QCRA, how we can better integrate decision making from bottom up QSRA, and we've got Graham who's going to be talking to us around whether Monte Carlo is dead. So we have Doug Oldfield from Risk Hive. He's going to be up first. We've got Matt Livingstone from Optimize Risk. Then we have Andrew Allen from HKA and Graham Miller from Risk Control. But they'll do their own introductions shortly as it comes to their presentations. So rough agenda for today. We're going to start off with some short introduction to the IRM and a welcome. That will be myself and Wes. We'll take you through that. We'll move on to Doug's presentation on better understanding models with sensitivity analysis. Then on to Matt with integrating bottom-up risk management into strategic decision making, followed by Alan on practical insights from quantitative cost risk assessments on major programs, and finally, last but not least, Graham, who will be presenting a new software, a new approach to managing and understanding risk. And finally, we'll have a group Q&A at the end. If you can message your questions, there's a little question box in the right-hand side of your control panel, but we will be doing 1 or 2 questions after each presentation. So if you have any burning questions that are really specific for that presenter, please do fire them in and we'll get them asked. Moving on now to Wes, who'll give his brief introduction.
Thanks, Danielle. Morning, everybody. Welcome to the final IRM Infrastructure SIG webinar of 2020. As Danielle said, my name's Wes Cadby. I'm the chair of the group. It's been a strange year, but I'd like to think we've been pretty active over the last few months, bringing a range of different subjects to risk management professionals across the globe. So I'm quite excited about this one. We've got 4 great speakers. Before we get into those speakers, I just want to take you through a few slides, if I can. So for those of you that are new to the Institute of Risk Management, the IRM is the leading professional body for enterprise risk management across the world. So they provide internationally recognised qualifications and training, publishing research and guidance, thought leadership, and setting professional standards for the entire risk management community. They've been in existence for over 30 years. Have some great qualifications, which I'll talk about in a second. And in 2019, the IRM also welcomed the Institute of Operational Risk under the umbrella of the IRM group. Next slide, please, Danielle. So some of the qualifications that the IRM offer, like I said, they are internationally recognised. The long-standing qualifications such as the International Certificate in Enterprise Risk Management, the International Diploma in Risk Management, and also the Financial Services Certificate. Most recently, there's been 2 new certificates recognising the changing world, the Digital Risk Management Certificate and the Supply Chain Risk Management Certificate. And I thoroughly recommend the learning that you get from taking these qualifications. Next slide, please, Danielle. So we always like to start our webinars with a brief safety moment, and historically we've always changed these for each webinar, but this particular safety moment has been long-standing now for about 18 months on all of our events, physical events, and all of our webinars, and it concerns mental health and well-being within the construction industry. So did you know that working in construction you are 6 times more likely to die from suicide than from a fall from height? Between 2011 and 2015, rates of suicide among low-skilled workers in the UK construction industry were 1.6 times higher than the national average. This year, current stats show that you're 3 times more likely to become a victim of suicide as opposed to someone outside of the construction industry. And within this survey that I presented on there, over 1,400 construction workers committed suicide between 2011 and 2015, which is an average of nearly 4 people per calendar day throughout that time. And one of the most disturbing facts is that from the people that were surveyed, more than a quarter of construction employees have considered taking their own life, which is it's unfathomable. It's an astronomical figure. I'd like to think, certainly in the UK, we've got some of the most aggressive and stringent physical health and safety regulations and laws, but it's evident from some of the stats when it concerns suicide within our industry that we might not have got it quite right when it comes to health and well-being and mental health. So it's a very, very important reflection, I think, for us in this industry to note that, you know, it's that people need to be okay. Next slide, please, Danielle. And this slide, we've used this for quite a while now on some of our webinars, and it's a really useful tool for anybody in the construction industry or the infrastructure industry. The website, which is listed below, outlook.gihub.org, is a group that's been set up to support the G20, driving an agenda of sustainable, resilient and inclusive infrastructure. And what it does is it gives you global forecasts on the current levels of investment within infrastructure across the globe in all sectors, and also its view of what investment is needed within those sectors across the globe. So, for example, on the bottom left of that screen, I've pulled out the UK stats. The current investment for the time period is about $1.7 trillion. Apparently, the investment needed is $1.8 trillion, so a gap of $148 billion. And that website will allow you to drill down into the specific sectors where there's deficits and where those gaps sit. It's a really useful tool to understand what the next few years and decades looks like in your particular part of the sector. So I thoroughly recommend having a look through that. So that was all I wanted to go through. What I'll do now is hand over to Doug to kick us off with our first presentation. Over to you, Doug. Just a little mic check, make sure we can hear you.
Yep, hopefully you can hear me okay. Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much to Wes and Danielle and obviously the IRM for organising this session. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is the importance of sensitivity analysis. And I always like to kind of show my face right at the start, so I'm not just a disembodied voice for the whole presentation. But just to kind of, in case there's any bandwidth issues, I'm just going to turn my camera back off. There we go. So hopefully my face has now disappeared from your screens, and you can now see my PowerPoint presentation that's on the screen. So some of you kind of may know me already from the 11 years or so I spent on the sales team at Palisade, as well as doing training and consulting on using at risk for Monte Carlo simulation in models. Nowadays, I'm the head of sales and business development for another software company called RiskHive. We've got an excellent risk management tool called RiskHive Enterprise Risk Manager, which of course I'll be very happy to discuss or show anybody at another time. And we've also got a tool called Ariska, which is all about sensitivity and Monte Carlo simulation that you'll see a little bit of later on. The third thing that you probably need to know about me is that I've got 3 young children who we home educate. So there's a reasonable chance, probably around P25 in stochastic terms, that at least one of them will interrupt my presentation at some point. So apologies in advance if that does happen. So I'm guessing that most, if not all of you, will have heard of sensitivity analysis as a technique. But I wonder how many of you will have actually run it on models before. I think as a profession, there's rightly a big push towards using quantitative risk analysis on project, program and enterprise risk. But over the course of this presentation, I'm hoping to sow a few seeds about the importance of sensitivity analysis as a tool for controlling and managing costs and budgets. Of course, the technique can also be used on schedule as well, but today I'm just going to be really concentrating on the cost side of things. So for those of you who don't really know an awful lot about it, sensitivity analysis is it's really a technique which helps us to understand what the key drivers are within a model. So what the technique involves is changing each of the inputs to a model by a certain amount, often 10 or plus or minus 10 or 20%. And then measuring how much the output that we're interested in moves as a result of each of these changes. We can then rank them in order to see which inputs are causing the biggest change to our project budget or MPV or whatever other type of model that you're looking at. Now, my boss, Ian Baker, uses an analogy that I very much like about quantitative risk analysis and sensitivity analysis. And in his view, quantitative risk analysis is very much the icing on the cake when it comes to looking at modelling project costs and budgets. It can be a really important piece of the jigsaw, but we shouldn't really assume that it's the whole puzzle. So if kind of QRA is the icing and the decoration on top, then what sensitivity analysis tells you is what's inside and how much of each ingredient we're using. So in cake terms, for example, this really isn't the cake for you if you've got an intolerance for dairy or a nut allergy. And similarly, sensitivity analysis will highlight if there's anything contained in our models that we need to be particularly concerned or worried about. Of course, you can do sensitivity analysis in an at-risk, a crystal ball, or model risk, or whatever. But the tornadoes that get generated will only then include model inputs which contain a probability distribution. What they don't show is everything else. And it might be that over the course of this morning you see this quotation again, but for me, I love this quote. I've been using it for years and years, and it's a really important thing to accept and acknowledge. I think there's a temptation to assume that models are always correct, but they're really not. Just as none of us know what the future is going to hold, of course, neither do our models. And what we try and do with models is we use them to try and build a realistic representation of what the future looks like, so that we can make decisions in the present day. And really, for me, sensitivity analysis as well as quantitative risk analysis are both vital techniques to hopefully make our models just that kind of little bit less wrong and a lot more useful. So what I want to do now is kind of hopefully bring this technique of sensitivity analysis to life a little bit more. And the tool that I'm going to use for this is one of RiskHive's, which is called RiskHive, a risk analyzer. Like they say on the BBC, if you're from the UK, of course there's other softwares which may be available that perform a similar function, and the tool itself really isn't the important thing here. It's really the methodology or the process that I want to walk you through. So if I just go and load up my little example model here, this is a really simple, simplistic little example model that I like to use. And the reason I like to use this is because it's nice and simple with all of the information on one page. But of course, in real life, typically the models that I see are lots, much more complex with a lot more tabs and inputs. But this one, it's a much easier one to demonstrate. So if we look at this particular model here, what we've got some inputs to our model which are going to be kind of around this area here in the spreadsheet. We're then going to have some calculations which are going to be around about here, and then at the bottom down here what we have is an output. But with Excel, the reality is that when we look at our workbooks or worksheets, we can only really see what our eyes tell us. We don't know for sure what's actually going on. We naturally make some assumptions. And for my mind, sensitivity analysis is really about doing a couple of things to a model. So the first part is about changing inputs, collecting the results, and then seeing how those changes impact upon the project cost or whatever your key metric is. And of course, that's something that you can do manually if you've got the time, inclination, and thoroughness. If I wanted to, I could systematically change each of these inputs to the model, see how the output reacts to the changes, write down all the results, and come up with my own tornado. But even with a small model like this, doing that process by hand would probably take about half a day to do it properly. Now, of course, with a much larger model, that would take a considerable amount more time. The second purpose of sensitivity analysis for me is really one that can only be achieved through the running of an automated process using a software tool. And that's when we can use it to look for issues with the way that a model has been built that might impact in some way upon our outcomes. And this has got a term for it. It's called model risk. It's kind of used quite a lot in financial services. And it's really about kind of understanding what the issues are with a particular model, and trying to do a forensic audit of every cell in a large model, plus all of formula and linkages to other inputs is something that's probably drive you mental, and you probably miss out on lots of important elements as well. I don't know, as a little analogy, I don't know if you've ever tried to count up to 1 million before. I think I did it a few times when I was younger, and my 8-year-old seems to want to do it from time to time. And it starts off quite easy. You know, everyone can count up to 100 or even a few hundred or so, but then actually it gets progressively harder as you go through, and you struggle to remember where you are with everything. You start missing or duplicating numbers. And for me, doing a forensic audit on a big model is very much like that, in my opinion. So I'm going to just close the model down for a second, and then I'm just going to grab the icon and then just drag it on top of the Ariska analyzer here to get it started up. So the first thing that it's going to ask me is what's the kind of key metric, if you like, that I'm interested in. Let me drag stuff over here. When I use GoToMeeting or Teams or anything like that, everything kind of resizes in an unusual way. But the key metric that I'm going to be interested in down here is my selling price or bidding price or budget or whatever you want to call it. As I said, the labels themselves don't matter. It's really the process that's the important thing. But I'm selecting that this is really my key metric that I'm particularly interested in. And so when I click on OK, what's going on is just some kind of background analysis. And you can see up here that what we've got, if I just kind of maybe drag my model down here a little bit as well, so we can kind of see it vaguely on the same screen. This is now, or the process that's just happened is that the software has just very much got under the skin of the Excel model. And one of the benefits of doing the kind of process of sensitivity analysis using a tool is that within a very short time frame, we can understand more about the structure, the drivers, and how it runs than the person who built the model in the first place. So here we know where all the formulas are, we know where all of the inputs are, and how the model's wired together. We find all the macros, all the named ranges, and so on. It's even identified this hidden worksheet over here, which we couldn't see with the naked eye. I'm going to exclude from the analysis because we don't really need it on here. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to change a couple of the display options just to kind of bring it to life a little bit, because I think it kind of helps to see what's going on under the bonnet, if you like, when an analysis is running. So up here there's a big green button that says Go. And this button came out of some work with the MOD, so the Ministry of Defence in the UK, who said that they wanted a tool which was usable by novices as well as experts, and we figured a big green Go button probably fitted that bill quite nicely. So if I hit this button, then what you're going to see in the background is the tool cycling through each of the inputs to the model and changing them by a certain amount. I've put it in this kind of iterative mode, so you can see the flash and see the model actually doing its work. I think that the default is plus or minus 10%, as I said, and what it's doing is keeping track of the results. So all of those inputs to the model have been changed, and now what we've done, we've moved across to this sensitivity tab. Which is where we have the big green button on start. Now we're on sensitivity, and this is where we have the outputs from that sensitivity analysis. So really quickly, hopefully you can see that each row represents one of the inputs from the Excel workbook. They've been ordered or ranked so that the input up at the top, this one up here, is the input which caused our selling price or bidding price to wobble or to vary by the most. And then as we kind of go down the list, they become progressively less important in the overall scheme of things. So what this is telling me, if I kind of just look at the little readout up here, it's telling me that the number one driver for this particular model can be found in cell H14, and it came from the individual user who built the model typing in the number 2.2. The format is in percentage, and so it's going to come out as 220%. That's the value that's in the model, and the outcome effect. If I kind of change it by plus or minus 10%, which is this 0.9 and 1.1. That's the kind of the variability that we're changing it by. we can see that actually across the piece it comes out with about 4 million. There's about 2 million for each side of our tornado graph over here. So if it goes down by 10%, our selling price or bidding price goes down by 2 million. If it goes up, it goes up by 2 million. Of course, models aren't always this linear by nature, but it is very much a little simple example model. So if we look at the tornadoes, we can see that this top item up here is actually about 3 times the effect of the next biggest driver here, which has a value of 2 million. So the value of this second input is actually several orders of magnitude, a bit higher than this top one, but the variability is much lower, which shows us that it's a really important lesson that sensitivity analysis and indeed understanding models, it's not just about picking the biggest number and assuming that that's the thing that's going to have the biggest impact on our outcome. So for me, this is the kind of the first purpose of sensitivity analysis. It's about finding out what the key drivers are within a model, and for me, if we're working with big models, whether they're for costs, for risks, budgets, or indeed anything else, I think that running sensitivity analysis before we do our quantitative risk analysis, our QRA, makes a lot of sense, because what we can do with this kind of doing sensitivity analysis as a first step means that we can pre-screen our model to find out what the most significant factors are so that we can really focus our Monte Carlo efforts on those. Much like counting to a million, having to come up with a 3-point estimate, as well as thinking about what type of probability distribution to use when you've got thousands of inputs to a model is a dispiriting task. Excuse me. It's very hard to do well. I'm just going to take a little gulp of tea here. As you can hear, my voice is a little bit croaky already. I think I've got a little bit of a cold coming on. Yeah, so people start off with kind of good intentions when they've got lots and lots of inputs to put distributions around. But then in my experience, more often than not, if you've got a lot of stuff to do, more often than not, it ends up in a checkbox exercise. What I used to see all the time is people make everything into a triangular distribution and add plus or minus 20% to everything, and great, we've now completed our Monte Carlo exercise, and who cares about whether the results are accurate or not? At least we've done it. And for me, I think that's a little bit of a waste of time, and it's really much more efficient to use sensitivity analysis to understand your top 10, 20 or 50 drivers, and then really concentrate your Monte Carlo modeling on those. I think it also leads into another kind of useful area, which is the area of stress testing. Now, the idea of stress testing has been around for some time, but really after the 2008 financial crisis, it started to be talked about a lot more in the context of banks making sure that their capital adequacy ratios were robust enough to survive a series of tests that were set by the ECB or the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and so on. And we can do stress testing using something like at risk. And indeed, kind of part of the purpose of Monte Carlo simulation is really to understand the impact of the brown stuff hitting the fan. But actually, once we've done our sensitivity analysis, we can also use that to focus on the things that are important. We can pick the top drivers within our model and then measure the impact of a change to that. So if I choose this top impact up here and put in maybe 5, let's put in actual 5% and apply that, then we can see that the impact of a 5% increase to my number one driver is going to have an impact of maybe adding 1 million onto my cost model. So for me, stress testing is an important part of risk management in its own right. Of course, if we're particularly sensitive to a particular input, then it really makes sense to do some scenario testing to see if we can withstand it increasing or decreasing. If a 5% increase in a cost is going to tip a project into unprofitability or blows through the budget, then maybe we might want to put sufficient controls in place to mitigate that risk. Maybe it's about taking out a long-term pricing contract with a particular supplier, or hedging our exchange rates, or whatever. For me, risk management isn't just about dealing with problems when they occur. It's about proactively incorporating that risk-based decision making throughout the process. So let me kind of try and get them back on the same screen again. There we go. I think I need a widescreen monitor to be able to do this particularly well, but there we go. Okay, so for me then, the second thing to kind of look at with sensitivity analysis is really about kind of understanding, making sure that we also understand and audit our model to make sure that it's doing what we expect it to be doing. So if I right click here and go to this cell, I can see, whereabouts are we, that my overhead rate here has been highlighted, and actually I can see that my overhead rate has been highlighted as 231%. Let's put that back to 220, which was the original value down here. This third input on here is quite an interesting one. If I right click on it, it's in D12, which is this area down here. If I go to the cell, actually what we can see is that it appears to be an empty cell. But if I look up here into my formula bar in Excel, I can see that there's actually a value of 1.8 million, a very precise 1.8 million almost, with lots and lots of decimal places. And it looks like it's probably white text on a white background, so we can't see it. So we don't know anything about why it's there. We just know that it's got an effect on the model. And we do a lot of auditing work. So RiskHive does a lot of auditing work and consulting work, and we often see this type of thing in submitted contracts or bids, and they can often be used to just tidy up the workbook, or to hide the things that make it work, or even fudge factors, which is something that we see quite often in government spreadsheets. And we find stuff like this in maybe 10 to 20% of models. And it's just stuff that you just really wouldn't be aware of otherwise without running some kind of a tool like this. Actually, if I just pop back into PowerPoint for a moment, I've got a slide on here about some of the savings that RiskHive have found or made for clients using this technique. Now, I appreciate that risk registers as well can often have some fairly large numbers in them, which is why Monte Carlo and QRA are important. But actually, there's a whole lot of zeros which would be on display here if these numbers were written out in full. And it's quite common to find these types of anomaly, especially on spreadsheets or templates that evolve over the years. Someone creates a large project budget sheet that gets used over and over again. And then at some point, somebody else adds something in because their numbers don't look right, or they want to improve how the sheet works. Everybody else then sees the improvement and starts using a new template, but no one really understands what the mechanics of the model are, and then the fudge factors, like our 1.8 million, get lost in the sands of time. So I'm sure that we've got a mix of people on this webinar, both from the supplier side of the fence as well as from organisations who contract the work out, and hopefully you can both see the value of the process. If you're working for a contractor, then you want to know where your drivers are and your budget and forecast, so that you can price work up accurately and win the business, and obviously make sure that you don't go blow through your budget at the end of the process. Whereas if you're a buyer, for example, in a government department, being able to do this type of analysis is very important in terms of making sure that you're spending people's tax money wisely. And so if I pop back into here, oops, whereabouts are we? Okay. Actually, let's lose that in the background so it's not too distracting. Oh, there we go. And one of the things that we do for the Ministry of Defence actually is that whenever a bid comes in, and it could be anything from boots to battleships, they're all kind of priced in Excel from the bidding companies. What the MOD do is run this with all the bids that are submitted in order to see what the key drivers are. And the next step they do is something that can be done manually, although it's much quicker to use a tool like this, is to then highlight the driver cells. And so if I just click that, this is a really, really useful little technique for anybody who kind of ever does any looking at models, looking at other people's models. I really like this technique, and it's what I'm going to do is just use Excel cell formatting to highlight or color the input cells to reflect their significance. So what we're going to do here is we're going to color the top 5 drivers in red, the ones ranked 6 to 10 excuse me, in orange, and then every other working input or constant, as Excel calls them, will be green, and these are the ones that are going to contribute in some way to the final output. And finally, any inputs that don't contribute to the output get coloured in grey. We don't know if they're good or bad, or what we intended or not. It's just something to be looked at. So if I click on the highlight, I'm going to run the process, and now once it finishes, there we go, I now have some colours in my workbook. And this is really, I think, a really useful technique, I think, because the human eye likes colours and patterns much more than it likes looking at raw numbers in an Excel worksheet. And so as a risk manager, when I look at a model like this, what I then do is send it back to the person or the organisation who created the model, and ask them more about the things that are in red. You know, whereabouts do these numbers come from? You know, please can you explain whereabouts you got 220% from? You know, what's the background to it? And so the things that are in red would be the first things to focus on, followed by the things that are orange, and then the green ones have got less significant in the overall scheme of things. And by the way, what's this number over here that you've got put in, this 1.8 million? There's no line item for it. It just appears to be a random number of 1.8 million, but it's number 3 on the significance list. You know, so what is it, and what does it do? This grey one over here that we've found, it's shown as an input, but it doesn't really contribute anything. You know, what were you intending to do with it? Do you want to fix this? And you know, this is kind of all really useful stuff, but it's just on a very small spreadsheet. On a bigger, much more complex spreadsheet, this is even more difficult to do manually as an exercise, much more difficult to do manually. And so hopefully you can see the value of this type of process. And you know, hopefully by this point, you can appreciate the value of sensitivity as a technique it's distinct from Monte Carlo simulation. It's a process that can be performed manually. As I said, we can do this on a manual basis, but it's very time consuming. And so the number one reason why you want to get a tool like this or any other is just how much time it can save if you are looking for those sort of model risks. And if you've ever spent any time in the evenings or weekends trying to get to grips with a spreadsheet to locate an error or to be able to sign it off, then hopefully you can see how much easier it is with a big green button. Although of course other similar softwares may be available that you can just press to get your answers. So yeah, that's my presentation. So thank you all very much. And are there any questions, Wes and Danielle?
Hi Doug, thanks very much for that. So some great insights there. I've never actually come across clients running sensitivity analysis on submitted tenders, so really interesting to hear. Great idea, but probably could just be my ignorance. So Wes, I know you've had a couple of questions. Have you selected a few that you'd like to ask now?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So we'll just do a couple of questions now, and then we'll do a final Q&A at the end. So I'm going to try and wrap 2 questions into one if I can, Doug. So sorry to put you straight on the back foot, but somebody's asked, so in a project environment, it seems very basic stress testing or sensitivity analysis is done, and is often not considered as part of the decision making, with people just focusing on things like P50 and P80 outputs and not really considering any of the other options. Why do you think this is? Is it a lack of understanding, or is it optimism bias, or anything like that? And then combined with that, somebody's asked, how can you perform sensitivity analysis before you develop a credible understanding about the nature of the risks or uncertainties by developing statistical distributions based on data, experience, or otherwise? And I guess the reason I've brought those 2 together is, is garbage in, garbage out one of the reasons perhaps why it isn't used as widely as it should be?
Okay, thank you very much, Wes. So I'm gonna now try and remember both parts of the question so that I can answer. And so I'm gonna do I'll do the second part first, and I might ask you for a little reminder of what the first part of the question was afterwards. In terms of wanting to kind of understand a thorough statistical model, applying probability distributions, how can you kind of do the sensitivity analysis? Please don't for a second think that I'm suggesting that this technique should be done instead of Monte Carlo simulation, you know, I've sold at risk for 11 years. I've probably spent maybe 3,000 hours building and demonstrating and playing with at-risk models, which is about a year and a half of solid working hours. So I'm very much a believer in quantitative risk analysis and understanding that. For me, I think this is a really useful precursor to it for the reasons that I mentioned earlier on. You know, we can use it to understand what the drivers are in our model, and then we can use it to focus our Monte Carlo efforts on modeling those accurately. So it's really not designed to be a replacement, but it's just a useful technique to help us then figure out what to focus our efforts on. And of course, the other thing as well is finding those errors, those almost like the systemic errors within the model itself that's been built, that with all the best will in the world, you could put Monte Carlo, you could put probability distributions on every single input in a model. But then if you've got something on white text on a white background, what are you going to do with it? You're not going to find it. So it's, as I said, it's not competitive to Monte Carlo. It's a complementary tool in my opinion. And if you wouldn't mind, Wes, I'd like a little refresh of the first part of the question.
Yeah, so the question was that somebody said stress testing doesn't seem to be used particularly well, and definitely not used in decision making as part of their world in project risk management. What would you think the reasons for that would be? Is it a lack of understanding? Is it optimism bias? People don't want to think about stress scenarios, you know, that sort of thing.
I think it's a combination of all of those. I think possibly Monte Carlo is maybe a little bit to blame for that as well, because I think that the idea is that, okay, if we're running our Monte Carlo, we come up with a credible distribution. We've got our P10, P50, P90, or whatever metrics you want to do, P80, P90, P95. And so what we've done we've understood what it looks like. We've understood what we think our worst case scenario is, and we've plugged that into our distribution. But actually, as you say, sometimes there is an optimism bias, and people don't necessarily want to push out that right hand parameter on the distribution too far, because it can then impact on the results. And so what you then tend to see is sometimes the stuff that you might want to stress test is actually suppressed as a possible outcome for Monte Carlo. And then, of course, it gets forgotten about. That's what happens with model building. People spend a lot of time building models. They make decisions about what to include, what not to include, what the inputs are. And by the time the model gets to the decision makers, actually, I think often that sort of the thinking behind how the model was built in the first place sometimes gets lost. And so I think what I would love to see is on any kind of project risk appraisal, an element which is okay, so these are our top three inputs, either good or bad, and if there's a change of these by plus or minus 10%, or if they increase by 5%, this is the outcome. And actually having that on the project risk report, on the template that's produced by the model builder, I think would be a really, really positive, powerful addition, because then it gives even if people don't do anything with it, at least the decision maker has got the ability to say, am I going to look at this recommendation? Does this concern me? Do I want to do anything about it, or am I just going to kind of carry on with business as normal? But at least the work's been done and the decision has been made.
Great stuff. Thanks, Phil. There's been a few more questions come in, but conscious on time, we'll try and wrap them up at the end. So I'm going to hand over to our next speaker now. So Matt, just give us a little mic check if you can.
Good morning, everyone. How are we all doing today?
Perfect. So Matt, you should have control of the screen now. Perfect, we can see that. So over to you, Matt.
Perfect. Thanks very much, everyone. Good morning, all. I'm going to go for a slightly different tack, so I'm not going to get into some of the details that Doug's very comprehensive presentation covered before. I'm going to look at how we can better integrate bottoms-up decision making from risk management application. So this is going to be about deploying QSRA through the organisation. Before we begin that, my name is Matt Livingstone. I'm a managing partner at Optimize. I lead the firm's aerospace and defence sector team. So Optimize is a firm of risk management specialists, and we're working with lots of international clients at the moment to try and get better, effective risk management built into the decision-making process. Myself personally, I've amassed a lot of experience over the years in a variety of sectors, so not just based in defence and aerospace. I've worked across multiple industries, supporting lots of different clients, and I've held roles in project management, project controls and risk management in the past. I do specialise in project risk management. It's where my love is, and really what I like to do in the project space is to really get good quality data out of the project team. And then one of my key attributes, one of the key things that I like to do is I like to take that data and try and push it up into the organisation to make sure that the decisions at the top are informed by the data at the bottom. And that's some of what we're going to talk about in today's presentation. I do have a keen interest in quantitative schedule risk analysis, as you've probably guessed from me speaking today. And as I've mentioned previously, we as Optimize support lots of different clients. One of my main clients at the moment is a government client, and we're working on multi-billion-pound capex projects with them, making sure that UK taxpayers' money is invested in a way which is wisely done for maximum value for the taxpayer. I'm also a member of the IRM's Infrastructure Risk SIG, as you probably guessed, and I'm a regular speaker at industry events. And my contact details are at the bottom there. If anyone wants to learn more about Optimize or myself, feel free to get in touch at any point after the presentation. Okay, so before we begin, I apologise in advance to those that I'm teaching how to suck eggs on this one, but it just needs to be absolutely clear how decisions are made in organisations. So a lot of major organisations, complex organisations, most that I've worked with use a model similar to this, the VMOS model. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. Starts out with setting the vision for the organisation. So what's the organisation going to achieve? What's it trying to look like in X number of years? And then we look at the mission, which is the route to get there. And then from the mission, we break it down into objectives. They're tangible, usually looking at how we achieve elements of the mission, which then informs the vision. Then we break it down again to strategy. Then we break it down again to tactics. So much like the old analogy of how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time, an organisation is no different in its decision-making process. We start at the top and we work our way down. The problem that sometimes generates for us in risk profession space is that the thinking goes that way too a lot. So a lot of the thinking is usually quite top-down. And that's sometimes a bit of a barrier for us. So today's talk is going to be about how we try and flip that decision-making process a little bit and start taking data from the bottom, working it up to make sure that we understand how we achieve some of these things that are at the stratospheric level of the organisation. Context is king. Big caveat section, this slide. It's a maxim that I live by. I'm sure a lot of risk professionals live by it as well. Application of risk management, application of QSRA, it needs to be done in the right way, in the right context. If it's not done in the right way, in the right context, it can be more damaging than it can be helpful. So some of the key things we need to think before we start on a journey around how we use information from the bottom of the organisation to feed up into the top of the organisation is, when we're using the QSRA, what are we trying to achieve? What's the organisation trying to achieve by running that simulation, by running that model? What decisions being underpinned by it? How's the output to be used and what value should be gained from it? So we have to understand how things are going to be used up in the organisation to make sure that the inputs are all credible at the bottom and we get the right output from it. Some of the typical examples of the need: we use it to inform a delivery range for projects, programs or portfolios. Sometimes it's used to underpin negotiations with suppliers, so we might want to understand from a bid perspective what suppliers are including as risk, what those impacts could do to a project or a program. It can be a useful tool for that. And sometimes it's about identifying where risk and uncertainty resides in the organisation and how we effectively manage it in the different tiers throughout the business. So as I mentioned at the start, really, QSRA, it's a tool that we have in our risk professionals toolbox, but its application can be damaging if it's used incorrectly. So much like we may choose to use a scalpel in some applications. If you're chopping a tree down, it's probably not the best thing to use. You could probably get through a tree with a scalpel, but a chainsaw under competent use is probably a much better tool. So it's the same thing with anything we take out of our risk professionals toolbox. We just need to make sure the application is correct. So today's presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on how we use QSRA to manage risk and how the organisation, and not just projects, should be using the data from the bottom to manage risk at the top. Some of the stuff around, the earlier examples around informing the delivery ranges, again, there may be better tools to use, dependent on where you're at in the maturity of a project or a program or a portfolio or even an enterprise. In early phases when there's lots of unknowns, you might choose to use benchmarking data. You might use use something like reference class forecasting. They may be more appropriate at that time. As we get better data, better understanding of inputs, we may transition to QSRA or QRA approach. So I'm not going to cover that range setting element today. Today's going to be more focused on how do we understand the risk in the business, and how do we ensure that we're making the right steps in managing that risk across the business to improve confidence in attainment of mission, vision, objectives, strategy, etc. Okay, so do we understand the impacts of risks on an organisation's mission and vision? Somewhat. So why is that? I think there's a couple of primary reasons, really. The first is the impacts are often assessed in the context in which they're identified. And what I mean by that is, when we identify risks, they're usually at project space. There'll be a really thorough assessment of the risk in project space. As it moves up through the organisation, sometimes it becomes quite hard to revalidate it, or some organisations aren't mature enough to make those steps to look at a risk and look at its compounded effect across a portfolio or an enterprise level. And most organisations are made of a web of interrelated actions and activities too complex to accurately assess with a human mind. So as the next point makes, really, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to accurately assess the true holistic impacts of risks in the environment of a complex organisation using a human mind alone. And that's why we look for these simulation tools and using applications such as PRA and Risk Hive and others, where they do a lot of the heavy mental load for us and try to give us some credible outputs that we can use to inform decisions. So at the moment, what we tend to do in organisations is we tend to look at the compounding forecasts of projects in an organisation or business as usual activities. They will usually have a level of maturity at a higher standard than other elements of the organisation when it comes to use of QRA. We'll usually take those outputs, and then we will do something in terms of a take a view position on the risks, the enterprise risks. So we'll model down here. We've got some high level risks up here, and they don't come together in a way which is stochastic. It's not a simulation. We've taken some outputs from a simulation down here. We've applied some thought process, and we've tried to come up with a rough indication of what that's going to do at the top of the business. So fundamentally, is this good enough? I think it's very much in a lot of organisations, we're still on a path of maturity. At the moment, me being a risk professional, I look at it and I think it's probably not good enough when we're getting into significant endeavours, organisations that are spending billions of pounds or dollars of taxpayers' money, or billions of dollars of shareholders' money on decisions that should be driving to the organisation's top level mission, vision, and the objectives. We need more confidence. So why is no, I suppose, the right answer? It's the ever more connected world. So just looking at some of what we deem in Optimise as external risks to typical organisations that impact across the organisation. The Space Shuttle Columbia disaster, it generated huge impacts across multiple organisations around the world. We were looking at design scrubs, redesign, remanufacture of assets coming out of the learning from why the disaster happened. There was significant safety process reviews. There was big safety culture confirmations across the globe because organisations were scrambling to try and make sure that something like that wasn't going to happen to them. Fukushima, another prime example. We had nuclear indemnity requests from supply chain partners across the globe. Anyone that was working in the nuclear industry was really worried about how it was going to impact on our ability to engage with the supply chain. There was major safety systems changes across the world as a consequence. Grenfell Tower fire, material uses investigation, supply chain perception of risk, the fire risk changed. Even though there was no legislative change coming out the back of Grenfell, the risk perception by the supply chain meant that there was delays, there was performance issues because the supply chain were worried about what liability they were taking on as a consequence of this incident that's in the forefront of our minds. The 9/11 terror attacks, Brexit, COVID-19, as we're all suffering through at the moment, huge mass IT change, digital security enhancements, working from home efficiencies and performance, site and office working efficiencies and performance, Deepwater Horizon, the global financial crisis. These were all huge events that are becoming, unfortunately, more and more common, and a lot of organisations aren't planning for them or don't fully understand their impact from the bottom all the way up. As I said at the start, the world is becoming ever more connected. All of these international borders are becoming more and more blurred. Trade deals, although not necessarily at the moment in the UK with the Brexit trade deal, but hopefully at some point in the future, trade deals are making things free movement of goods easier, or international trade easier, which means that an implication that happens on the other side of the world that you didn't have your eye on could have a fundamental impact on your business. So understanding that risk profile throughout the organisation and putting it into some form of model will really help you have a more accurate, not necessarily precise, but a more accurate view of where you're likely to achieve your objectives and your mission and your vision for the business. So I'm just going to quickly talk through the current best practices, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think we might be able to do things a little bit better. So typically in an organisation, you'll have this sort of a structure from a schedule perspective, and it's widely known as an IMS, an integrated master schedule. Now it'll vary in use in terms of the applications. At the bottom here in project space, project A, BAU, OPEX B, project C, you might be using Primavera P6. You might still be using something like P6 or a Microsoft project or an alternative planning software in program A and B space. And then depending on the maturity of the organisation, it may continue all the way up to the top, or things might start transitioning into Excel spreadsheets or PowerPoint presentations. When you get to a certain level, it tends to get simplified. But if we can try and build that structure of what we deem as an integrated master schedule throughout an organisation from top to bottom, it gives us a view of the forecast of the build-up. It's cost loaded at all levels usually. It can be logically linked using soft or hard coding. So what I mean by that is if something moves out down in project A space, it would have a ripple effect up into the program, up into the portfolio, up into the enterprise. And that's a powerful tool in itself. And as I said, this is current best practice. So a lot of organizations don't even have this, but working towards this is a key goal for better understanding the decision-making process. And it also enables what I'm going to talk about next as well, which is why it's so important to understand how it's going to work. So it forces performance or issues up into the organisation, as you would expect. If something moves down at the bottom, it affects something at the top, then we understand the potential impact at the top of the business, and we can trace it back down to try and carry out some work. So that's a positive in its own right. But it doesn't at the moment inherently consider the implications of uncertainty and risk. So this whole picture is either deterministic or it's used off the back of an EAC for a project or a program, an estimate of complete. It's generally some form of, underpinned to an extent guess, but we think we can do better. So if we just take an example in program space, we'll just take one of these programs, program A. What does a program, what's it supposed to do? So according to the APM Box 7th edition, a program or program management is the coordinated management of projects and business as usual activities to achieve beneficial change. And they're the key bits: beneficial, it's a benefit. So a program is responsible for achievement of a benefit. The integrated master schedule in its current form does not give confidence to decision makers about realization of benefits, objectives, or attainment of its mission and vision. So I'll just let that sink in for a second. As it stands at the moment, our scheduling system and our forecasting system for cost and time in complex organizations doesn't generally have a confidence range around it. It's normally a date and a number, which, as Doug said before, you know, all models are going to be wrong, some are going to be useful. I can tell you for a fact the one thing that we would never hit is that date and that number. There's always going to be a range around it. There's always going to be some confidence values required around it. And at the moment, the way that we forecast up into an organization does not give those confidence values. So we have two camps at the moment in most organizations. I'm generalizing here, obviously there'll be some organizations that are very mature, but in general, from my experience and from my partner's experience in Optimize, we have organizational decision makers that are in the camp of, we use risk management down in the bottom of the business, QSRAs run down in the bottom of the business, in operational space, in project space, and then we do some enterprise stuff at the top, but it's all quite woolly. We understand it, and there's some value at the top for doing that, but we don't fundamentally connect the two together particularly well. And then we have the risk professionals that are trying to move to organizational risk management. They're trying to do this full enterprise rollout, but for whatever reason, we're struggling to sell that to the operational and the organizational decision makers. So how do we go from this sort of stalemate position to something like this, which is trying to get the organizational decision makers to move to the side of the risk professional to understand the value that we can offer, and the value that that risk management can bring to their organization if it's used effectively throughout the business. So what's the solution? We've got to evolve. So we're going to take an integrated master schedule and we're going to convert it into an integrated master risk schedule. And it's exactly what you're probably expecting, but it's a really fundamental change that needs to happen sooner rather than later to make sure that the organizations are really using risk data to inform the best decisions. So we have these projects. We'll take another example here. We have these projects that inform a program, and that program is responsible for achievement of a benefit in yellow. There's usually a lag between when we achieve a program's outcome and when a benefit's achieved. And at the moment, as I've said, we just get those dates. So you'll get an output from a project that will roll up into a program space. There'll be a lag applied, and that's the forecast to the business on when that benefit's going to be realized. At program space, you'll get multiple benefits being realized, and they'll compound up to a point where we can say, right, that's when we think we're going to achieve an objective. But again, there's no confidence around that. There's no clear model data that's underpinning that above things that are done down in project space. So how do we evolve the IMS to the IMRS? Well, we run our models down in project level. So we do our QSRA or our QRA models, and we use those to inform the decisions higher up as we've done, but that doesn't include program risks. So we need to consider our program risks. So we're going to look at those projects, project A, project B, project C. We're going to look at the way that they've built their schedules, their cost, their uncertainty, and their risk. And then at a program level, we're going to do assessment of those, and we're going to do some compounding, and we're going to apply risks at program level as well. So you've still got this integrated master schedule where the program schedule will contain project A schedule, project B schedule, project C schedule, and it will have them all integrated. So we'll be able to see the interrelations between project B and project C, or project A and project C, the push and pulls and the gives and gets, and then we'll apply the project's risk onto them, and then we'll apply the program risks onto them, and that will give us a program P50, P80, P confidence value, whatever you want to look at, achievement of an objective, of an outcome, and then of a benefit off the back of that. So then we just move up. So we do the same thing with all of our programs. We get our outcomes in yellow, we get our benefits in blue, and then we'll move up again into portfolio space. We'll do the same activity in portfolio space to generate the objectives at the top in portfolio space. And we just carry on moving up through the organization, and that will give confidence ranges around attainment of these things. So you can see there in benefit realization space, you can get that data from the different models, and the same again in P80. So what's the point? From this, we can inform the organization of the confidence range. So that's one of the key bits for me. We can say to an organization, against your mission, against your vision, against your objectives, against your benefits. We can give you model outputs that are underpinned by uncertainty ranges at project, at program, at portfolio level. We can go and target those elements. So we can look at risk mitigation and realization against key risks across the organization that can have impacts up at the higher level of the organization, and we can start trying to do something about them by taking targeted action. So again, we can look at areas of the business where there's uncertainty. It might not necessarily be risk, it might just be there might be some key uncertainties that are driving some of the top level targets, and we can work back through the network to understand where they are, target effective management action against them to make sure that the confidence ranges start narrowing down. We have a tighter window to aim for and deliver against, and fundamentally that gives us value. So the strategic information to inform the business where to apply delivery pressure in order to achieve the mission, the vision, the objectives and the benefits. And that's the sell that we need to get across to a lot of organizational leaders, is if we can apply this approach of the IMRS, and that, you know, the next slide is going to talk about some limitations of use and some caveats around it, because there is a lot of work to do to get to a point where it can be effective, obviously organization dependent. But if we can give our organizational decision makers the data, the underpinning, the output of models with credible inputs that have been well thought through, then it's going to bring them on board with risk management and how we get the best value out of it in the future. So just a couple of considerations and limitations of application that we need to be thinking about. We go back to slide 1, the use, the context. What's the application? What's it being used for? Is it appropriate? It's useful for the management of uncertainty, but there might be better tools on the market for, or in our organization's corporate knowledge and corporate history for range setting, depending on where you're at in your different maturity points of your project, your program, your portfolio. So you might look at something like benchmarks or reference class forecasts instead, early phase, before you start applying something like this. The data, as with all models, and to Wes's earlier points, you're only going to get quality outputs if you've got quality inputs. And this is probably one of the bits that the organizations need to work on as a matter of urgency. If we want to get an IMRS in place, we need to make sure that the data, the schedules, the costs, the uncertainty and the risks are at a level of maturity that can support using an IMRS, and then that they're constantly maintained for the topicality of outputs. Now, with this integrated network, that should be happening anyway. You know, down in project space, down in BAU space, people will be keeping things topical all the time anyway. The same should be happening in program space, the same should be happening in portfolio space. So it shouldn't be a huge overhead to keep it topical once it's been built. It'll just be a case of looking at your organization, understanding where it is on the journey of maturity, and understanding what build states we have to do to get to a point where we can start running something like an IMRS. Aggregation is absolutely key. So any of you that know Professor Ben Flyberg from Oxford Global Projects and Oxford University, he's very keen at the moment on the law of regression to the tail, which is all about some of these bigger impacts that we've talked about, and some of these disasters that I mentioned on the earlier slide, and how we consider those. And we need to recognise that as we aggregate risk up through an organisation, through up to the higher levels, we need to understand that the likelihood might increase as a consequence, or the impacts might increase as a consequence, and it has to be reassessed as we move up through the organisation. And when we model, we need to recognise what's been incorporated in the lower levels, what's been incorporated at the upper levels, and understand how to aggregate those risks. Automation is going to be absolutely key. So you need to use technology to automate the process as much as possible. That's going to give you really big savings in terms of making sure that we don't end up creating a monster. As I said, the underpinning data should be being kept topical anyway, but when we're building the software, it could become a monster creation project, and we don't want to get into that. So we need to try and think about how we use automation to try and get the best value out of this with the minimum effort involved. And if you don't know how to do automation, then feel free to ask the specialists. And finally, best practice. So to Doug's earlier point around stress testing, we need to use that process of how do we scenario model through the network to stress test the outputs? How do we change the inputs of a model to take into consideration different events? And something like the Risk Hive software that Doug mentioned can really help facilitate that, which is really positive. We can consider pre and post mitigated QSRA runs, as well as looking at the impact of opportunities as well. So once you've got it embedded, you can build, you can improve, you can refine. There's lots of things that we can do to keep getting more and more accurate data out the back of the model. And that's it from me. Does anyone have any questions for me?
Thanks, Matt. That was great and really topical as well, you know, with the interrelated effect of things that are happening at a global level and right down to supply chain. So coming from like an aviation background most recently, that disruptive nature has been just unprecedented in the last few months. So I think what you're talking about is really topical and really important, and we've had loads of questions. So I'm going to ask one. There's so many good ones and I don't think we're going to get through them all, but one of the first ones that came through was, in a typical infrastructure client, their strategic risks are largely out with the control of many projects. Where have you seen projects, their risk exposure and actual QRA outputs actually influence an organization's strategic risks? And how would you model typical, such as political instability, economic challenges, government decisions, which are difficult to truly quantify? And it's a difficult one, but
that's a really good question. Really good question. I think there are a number of organisations that can do it effectively. I've been privy to a few. One of the big ones that does a really good job of doing some form of IMRS is BAE Systems, that I used to work for a long time ago. In a different life, it feels like, but they were really good at taking those project risk models and integrating up through a hierarchy into the organization. I think it's a really valid point in terms of those strategic high-level risks. They're sometimes quite tricky to model. There are a number of different techniques to do it to get the best benefit out. I don't really want to get into the technical elements, but if that person, whoever it is, wants to have a chat with me offline, I'm happy to do that. You know, I don't want to get into the mechanics of how we would tag risks to certain elements of the model, or how we would slice them up or not slice them up in this call, but there are ways to effectively get those sort of high level, really generic risks impacting in the correct way across the organization. It's just technique and understanding what you need to do from a technical perspective in the model. Does that answer both parts of the question, Daniel?
Yeah, no, actually much better put together than I've already put the question together. So Wes, I know you've got a couple more. Do you want to choose one or two to ask? I know we're a bit tight on time. Can maybe ask some more at the end.
Yeah, we'll save some up at the end. I will ask just one question if I can. The person asking the question has said, from experience, the integration and maintenance of schedules from project to program to higher up the organisation can be a very labour-intensive process. Practical challenges have included how to roll up schedules correctly, as you might lose important logic, which is challenging as changes are constant. So is there any best practice you can recommend on how you would robustly go around that?
So I think it comes back to, they're absolutely, you know, the question's another really good question, and it definitely is a limitation. It's one of the things that I mentioned in that last slide around you can do something to create a monster here, and that's the element of you have to be careful about understanding where your organization sits in maturity, where your integrated master schedule sits in maturity, and how it rolls up effectively. From my experience rolling out across a number of organizations, yes, it is absolutely challenging, but it's all about the context. So you've got to look at each of the projects, then you've got to look at how those projects interact with each other in program space, and then you apply your inputs based on that context. Again, as I said on the last slide, the use of automation is really key. So you have to understand what your absolutely key driving events are, your key driving activities in your schedules are, and make sure that you don't lose the wrong elements of the schedule, if you get me. So when you're rolling something up from project space, you need to understand the output of the project model and understand where your risks impact and your critical path lies in your secondary path, your tertiary, etc. and then you'll make sure that you capture the fundamental elements of that and roll it up into the next and roll it up into the next. So it as I said, it's a task to build it, but hopefully once it's built and once you're modeling consistently through the organization, it shouldn't be too much of a task to keep it all automated and rolling together. And as I said, from my experience in other organizations that other clients that I've supported, it's been a slog to get there, but once it's there, the value is more than paid for itself in terms of being able to clearly target where there's been problems. They've gone and targeted those problems, and we've had more confidence in delivery of whatever it is that we're delivering in terms of benefits or objectives, or the mission and vision bit. And we can tangibly manage that and review it through the organisation as it's happening, so we can see the benefits of of action that's being taken on the ground, filtering up into the business to give more confidence around that. So it is a really, really valuable tool. There are a lot of organisations that are able to roll it out right now. Absolutely not. Is there a lot of effort that's required? Absolutely. But I'm up for the challenge, and hopefully you all are as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. There's loads and loads of questions coming, but I'm conscious on time, so I'm going to just give you a breather until the final Q&A at the end, and we'll go straight over to our next speaker if we can. Andrew, just going to make you a presenter. Just give us a quick mic check. Make sure you can hear you.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Perfect. Over to you,
Great.
Andrew.
Lovely, thanks. Well, hi everyone. I'm going to hopefully share my screen, and with any luck, you'll be able to see my slides soon. So, Wes, if you could give me a sort of a...
Yep, we can see yours.
Sort of a, fantastic. Okay, and what I'll do is, I like Doug, I will turn my camera off so you get the chance to see those. So thanks very much to the IRM for organising today and inviting me to talk. I've been attending a number of IRM infrastructure SIGs meetings over the years, and always found them very valuable in terms of my learning as sort of originally a risk analyst moving into risk management. So I hope today is a useful session. I've also been enjoying the two sessions prior to this, and certainly fascinated by the work that's going on. So I'm Andrew Allen. I work for HKA. HKA is the spin-off of Hill International. It was its former claims consulting and advisory business. HKA includes Knowles and McLaughlin Lister in Australia, management consulting organisations and claims management organisations grouped together. So I look after risk advisory for them, and in terms of my role, I've been working for just over 20 years now, and I started life as a civil engineer, but I went into Thames Water helping their R&D team at the point when the government was interested in understanding a lot more about how to bring leakage down. So I was working on a joint engineering and operational team to find out the economic level of leakage. And that really got me interested, and actually not necessarily just about the specifics of engineering, but about sort of how the businesses work, how the business of getting infrastructure designed in the ground and operated for the benefit of society goes on. And infrastructure has really been my passion over the years. In doing that, I've been working to help get organisations, infrastructure organisations off the ground in terms of getting projects set up and programs. And one of the first things I did in that was help to build a risk management team, and risk management has been probably more than half of my career since. I certainly enjoy it. I find it fascinating, and I really enjoy the aha moment that sometimes comes from, you get with clients when they go, okay, you've helped me see this in a different way, and that's what I enjoy doing. Also along the way, helped in various bits of management finance, having sort of experience in building major program QCRAs. Sort of, it's not much of a stretch to sort of do financial consolidation, so I've helped out a number of organisations consolidate their finances and provide little bits of analysis of them. In terms of the services provided, always around sort of helping teams set up, but I've worked across different stages of the life cycle, all the way through to sort of those big change areas, whether it's a stage gate review or closeout. and or even just in general trying to improve risk management capability maturity. As a consultant, I'm often asked to help out either for a short period or a long period to get things up and running. I enjoy sort of facilitating workshops, really interesting ways of getting different views together to help people make a decision with sometimes not the best quality information around, but with a need to move forward and a sort of challenge to where they can move further. And with that, I've found sort of QCRA is a tool to help them understand the priorities, to get to know their risk information better and to understand where the priorities are. It's always been a challenge. I think it's a struggle for it to answer the question of how much a project would cost, which I'll come on to in a moment. But it's certainly good in terms of helping to allocate responsibility, helping to actually drive the risk management, the management of the risk, which is the main benefit, I think, of it. As I find we should sort of measure to support management rather than measure for its own sake. And with that, conveying the information that comes out of a QCRA has always been one of my interests. Not always sort of a great formats and things like that. I enjoy working with other people who can get sort of good dashboard designs, but I often take pride in making sure we're getting the information in it that makes a difference and starts to show them what they want to see. And I like to talk about QCRA and other things as well. So enjoy helping other people pick up on quantitative risk assessments and help organisations make better decisions. In terms of what I'm going to talk about today, it's in a way it's good sort of building on from Matt. I won't go into sort of. I'm taking some of the things that Matt said and taking them as a given in a way, but I'm intending to sort of offer a bit of a reflection of my experience helping to set up and project manage major program QRAs, and with Matt's focus on schedule, I'm gonna look at cost. Sometimes schedule is the bigger priority, but cost is usually there. It's the common unit for measuring resources, and it's frequent interest by parties, even when sometimes time should get a bit more focus. To some extent, from a management information perspective, how we present the information, cost has its advantages in that we can usually make some kind of linear addition simplification. It's not always valid. I'm not going to sort of dwell on why in this session, but we have the advantage that it's valid more often than it is for, say, subjective impacts or time. I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of QCRA information over time, what we should and shouldn't use it for. And the main part from a sort of presentation is sort of highlighting what should be in a risk analyst toolkit for planning and undertaking and presenting a QCRA. I've put in I know these slides will go out afterwards, so I've tried to sort of put some summary points there, but I put a bit more detail in the slide for anyone who's picking up on the slides or downloading a copy after the session. And then sort of finally focus on a couple of sort of management information examples that are perhaps above and beyond the sort of basic ones that everyone's seen, but ones I've found very useful, and certainly I know clients have found it useful too. Whether it's the risk analyst in the client, which is what I'll show you in terms of Pareto analysis, or whether it's important to the client decision maker in terms of the variance analysis or time phasing information. Obviously, we've had 2 talks already. I'm not going to touch on QSRA or sensitivity analysis. I know I have seen an interest from major programs to start to understand it, particularly driven by the assurers of those pieces of work. I have started to do scenario and stress test analysis as part of QSRA, where assurers have asked for that. It's quite often the assurer asking for it though, rather than the client. And I think actually with the assurer having asked it, clients are starting to see the value of it. I'm not going to cover any detailed pros and cons of QCRA or reference class forecast. That's a topic in its own right. I'm focusing on making the most of what we have and being aware of the pitfalls. And obviously we've got some other talks ahead covering innovation as well. So my title's fairly long. Why the long face? Why the long title? Well, I want to talk about major programs. I've worked in major programs. I think they're interesting because they're usually outcome focused, but often managed by an organization that's output focused. Lots of multiple integrated projects trying to achieve wider benefits often on behalf of a client, but need to, as Matt's chart showed, it's the tactics that you need to deal with day to day. It's that biting the elephant bite by bite. You need to deal with the integrated projects and the management of it. Major projects have complex resource coordination issues. We often simplify in our models, but major projects QCRAs often have a fall down slightly more because of the complexity and resource coordination challenges that major projects face. And also long time frames, huge amount of uncertainty. So on the right hand side, I'm saying there's massive uncertainty. Some of it's foreseeable, but not everything. It's one of the questions earlier. Some of it's stuff that's out of our control, but there's a lot we can manage. Some risks are going to break us, but many of them are not. So we need to get an understanding of what they are. And we also need to remember when we try to quantify risk, we also fall over in that we can't always do it. And some risks fall out the boundaries of what we can quantify. Doesn't make them any less important. So we always need to be aware of what they are in our models. Major projects are asking the big questions over that long time frame. How are we going to get there, and what are we going to do it with? They need to arrange massive amounts of funding. They need to constantly be keeping stakeholders happy that things are going in the right direction and that they're securing, demonstrating that they're providing value for money or the potential for a good return on investment. And things change, so they're often having to re-ask the question, okay, something's happened, what way now? And as risk analysts, as Matt said, it's often about making it clear under uncertainty that cost ranges is often all we can do. We're also understanding about how you can save, but we need to be realistic about it. But when it comes to QCRA, it's a great tool for helping us to understand where in our project structure carries most risk in the way we see it at the moment. And with a good open view, a good sort of view looking at top-down risk and bottom-up, you can start to see which projects are providing the hotspots and need a bit more attention, or might be managing things well and just need a bit more provision to hand. But we also need to understand the timing on a big long-scale project. You very rarely need all the money up front. That AFC that we're always managing to is often a long way down the line. It's very important that we understand if it's going to change and how, but also we need to sort of understand we've got to manage the money that we have at the moment. When are we going to need certain funds? What do we need to focus on now? And we also need to look back and sometimes say, well, why has our assessment changed? Why didn't we get there? So I'm not going to go into the same level of detail on these other slides. Like I say, I've put in a bit more information on some of these slides because I know you'll be able to access them after the session. But for me, looking back over the last years of QCRA information, is it helping? And we go back a long way to, okay, we just had a cost plan. And that cost plan might have included a proportion of risk, which clearly wasn't enough in terms of understanding the risk and trying to drive ownership, trying to drive management. So we've started to look at QCRAs. That helps us understand the risk and the owners, but then we start to understand on mega projects, we need to understand the structure of the organization to allocate things effectively and deal with things over a long time frame. And because things change, we need to be able to respond to what those changes are. But why are we always getting our assessments wrong? And I think it's partly because there's a justification problem. We're constantly asked to justify every level of modelling that we're doing. Particularly assurers are always asking for the next level of assessment. And sometimes I think that pushes us to a position where if we can't justify things get left out. We end up very quickly getting to a point where we start off in a difficult position anyway. We as much as we try to get the context and agendas together, sometimes we don't always understand that, and we might miss something important relative to an external stakeholder. And we're also blind to some extent in looking at things from only one perspective, but it's difficult to get hold of those other perspectives. And then we're sort of facing the challenge of things, certain risks are difficult to express, difficult to allocate. When it comes to the huge number of very unlikely risks, we haven't often got the time or the inclination to put those on registers. So we can very quickly understand why we are not in our QCRAs providing the full and complete picture that would provide an answer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. In terms of what are we left with, we've got a register that we can use to manage risk. So let's get on and manage it, but know that it's not everything. In terms of quantifications and uncertainty, what is in terms of that uncertainty, we know that there is additional uncertainty, but we can plan for that. And as Matt said, our models, it's garbage in, garbage out. Our model outputs are no more than what we put in the model. So let's be transparent about it. And we know from the works of others on reference class forecasting, certainly from about 10 years ago, I started to see clients having an interest in looking at how a reference class forecast might work with the data that's there, and you can invest in a more custom reference class forecast. What it shows you is that we miss things, but what it does do is it says, we know we need to be on alert for what's missing. We know we need to recognize what's coming up and be ready to look for it. We know we know that the scale of change is often bigger than our QCRA might suggest. So let's get on and manage what we have. And those silver linings that I talk about there is that when we have a QCRA, whilst it's limited, it helps us to allocate risk management responsibilities and be realistic. We can look at the risks that we have and manage and monitor them. We can track them. We can understand them. We can put provisions in place in good time. These long projects and planning means hopefully we are much better at looking at what's coming over the horizon, so that we're still getting provisions in the right place to be effective when they're needed. And in terms of that, once we know that things are missing, we're always looking ahead. It gives a good justification to understand we need to carry on looking ahead. We need to what tomorrow's problems might bring, and recognise that when things happen, and it's not my quote, but it's that we need to manage the risk that actually happens, not the one that we put on our register. So I'm going to focus on the left-hand side of these slides for this in terms of time. But what I've tried to do on these coming 4 slides is something you can download later. I've tried to talk about a risk analyst toolkit for QCRA. What do they need? What does a risk analyst need to plan, develop, build a model, present it, and report on it overall? So in answering those big questions, we need to, as sort of concurs with what Matt was saying, we need to sort of understand what the question is. And we need to understand how is our model going to be used in terms of supporting any decision, and what method are we going to get there. So a decision support plan, we need to agree the questions that are going to be asked, have some kind of terms of reference, and understand how our model will be used for it. And then as a result of our limitations, we need to understand what we're going to practically assume or exclude. We need to know what's in terms of sensitivity, we need to know what are our controlled variables that we're reasonably comfortable but want to look at in maybe 3 or 4 different values. But what are our uncontrolled ones where we're uncertain about that? It may also be that some of those controlled variables are uncertain as well, but we choose to leave them as a fixed point estimate, as a fixed or single point assumption, that we then communicate with our client that is a limitation of what we have. Also, managing QCRAs on a major program is often a project in its own right. It deserves its own project management plan and an understanding of who's going to be involved, what resources there are, what their needs are going to be, what else they need to worry about. It's a project in its own right and deserves some good project management. And then when it comes to the data itself, you need some kind of data model. You need to understand who owns the data at what time, how it's going to be valid, and how you're going to validate it. And a good tool for a risk analyst is having a data control and validation plan that covers the data flow, lets you understand who owns it and how you're going to deal with errors. And things iterate, particularly if you're working on a major program where people are working out their scope and schedule and cost at the same time. other things are changing around it, it's very likely you'll be working in an iterative environment. So you need to have good version control. And then you need to sort of have the ability of comparing the current model with previous models as well. In terms of major programs,
sorry, just wanted to jump in there. Just a 5-minute warning there, Andrew.
Okay, lovely. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
So we in terms of toolkits of what the major programs have. Major programs are complex structures. So we need to understand the structure and put that into our model, which effectively means we need a good coding structure that's there. But we also need to understand when we're putting a cost model together, we're trying to avoid wherever possible any gaps and overlaps. We can try to be exhaustive, but often we need to know what our limitations are in getting the full and complete picture. And we need good workshop process to help people do that, and a consistent set of bringing that risk information together. When it comes to presenting the information, we've got the classic there. We've got our S-curves and associated tools. We use our PID, but we can do that for converting quantitative to qualitative. And then when it comes to presenting the information, we need to sort of present the core tables from our core set of information. So having a core set of data that we can use to pivot data from, provide outputs, is absolutely crucial. And then we need to know how things change, either between iterations or over time. In terms of what we put in a report, going back to Matt's point, we need to understand context. Context is king. When we set about presenting what our results are, we need to explain the environment it's in, why we're doing it, what decision it supports. We need to explain how it's come about, what its limitations are, and then not just present the results and findings, but what are the consequences of it? What needs to happen? And should you go further? Should you develop? So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to show a couple of those management information examples. The previous slides, if you download them, are going into a bit more detail about some of the useful ones that you can use. And they vary from things that are single risk, where you could want to explore a single risk in a bit more detail, either to understand its sensitivity, the sensitivity of that risk in terms of how uncertain it could be versus its probability, or the fact that you may have simplified it in a PID diagram, but actually sometimes there's an opportunity component, or sometimes you might be worried about the peak aspect. In terms of multiple risks and the fact that we have reference class forecasts, how does that develop over time? Where are the big uncertainties coming from? That chart at the bottom is a sort of good illustration of how you can reflect over time how your QCRA sits against the uncertainty demonstrated by a reference class forecast. And as you move over time, that estimating uncertainty, the EU component in there, how is that, if that's reducing, are you genuinely getting better recognition of the threats that are coming about it? A good tool for risk analysts, and I think this is something that Doug was saying, a good way of understanding your drivers is to understand which risks are going to drive the result. And I've used this Pareto chart before. People are often aware of the 80-20 rule for sort of mean exposure, understanding that only a small number of the items drive the expected value, but it's an even smaller number sometimes of items that drive the uncertainty in the project. So charts like this can very much help the risk analyst know exactly where to go. It lets them know which risks not to worry about and not to dwell too much on the quantification. Echoing Doug's point there, you can spend your time where it matters. But also, it shows you where some of the gaps might be. I'll leave you to look at this, but the descending curve there sort of shows that actually sometimes it's the biggest risk that makes a substantial difference on the uncertainty. And if we've made exclusions of major risks, you can very quickly see the gap between your QCRA and the reference class forecast, where that might come from. Other tools in terms of looking at variances is understanding how things change. The fact that we're looking at individual risks, how they might change over a period of time. You can look at your register and quite quickly say what's come in, what's gone out, what's gone up and what's down. I often refer to it as a UDO variance analysis, those in, up, down and outs. And you can summarize that, and that summary is a very powerful tool for demonstrating to stakeholders what's changed in what direction. They may only see a net change, but what's changed where and by how much. And you can then itemize those changes. And you can plot those changes over time as well. You can look and say, how has our risk exposure fallen? But you can see how new risks have come in, but other risks have gone out. Some risks have increased, some have gone down, but our net change has gone down. Tools like this can really help you point to the big changes and quickly explain those top 5 variances that you've had over time. And final part, when it comes to time phasing, if you've got time phase information on your time phase information, you can start to plot, to look ahead to when is our project going to be most exposed. Sometimes people look at the start date of an exposure, sometimes people look at the end. If you look at the window, you can very quickly get that sense of, okay, which is the part of the project when we're going to be exposed to a large number of risks at the same time. And if you update this as you go forward, but also track the drawdown you've had, it gives you a chance of checking whether you might have some handback potential. This example on the page, that's often a question you might get. In this case, it might not be the case that you do have a handback potential. The final slide is the other way around. You may actually be drawing down ahead of what you expected, but is it because your risk has been worse than you expected, or maybe you're making greater progress? So thanks very much. Bit sort of quick race through, so I'll just get some water. But back to Danielle in relation to any questions.
Thank you. That was great. You were great there on the 5-minute wrap up. So
oh, that's good.
I've been able to do that, I don't think.
Yeah.
So we have had
certainly kept my throat going though, so thanks.
We have had questions through.
Okay.
Just saying how great the presentation was and how sophisticated the risk techniques that you've run through are. They were wondering whether, you know, for smaller or medium-sized organisations with less resources and less risk maturity, what would be the alternative for them when it comes to quantifying and understanding their risks, would you think?
Yeah, I think the lessons that smaller projects can learn from the bigger is just that sense of, we're going to miss things. A small project might say, well, actually, we're a small project with lower amounts of complexity. We might take greater faith in our QCRA, thinking as a smaller project we have an easier ride. But actually, from major projects and from things like reference class forecasting, you learn very quickly it's sometimes what we're missing is much bigger than what we've managed to capture. And even for a small project, it's worth sort of caveating what you produce and being aware of how things change. You can look at, say, the work of Ben Fluberg and others to look at some of the curves he's published in the past and say, well, if you don't necessarily have to invest in a reference class forecast, but you can go and look at the projects that are there and say, well, actually, if we applied a reference class forecast from some of his other pieces of work, how big is that change relative to what we're seeing? So do we think we've got the whole picture? And it's actually through some of those smaller projects that I worked on that I build up some of those little bits of management information on tracking variances. To some extent, that's an easier thing to do for small projects, and I certainly encourage teams to start thinking about the variances, what's changed, and to give themselves a better understanding about their risks.
Great stuff. Thank you, Andrew. There's loads and loads of questions come in, but conscious on time, we'll just go straight to the next speaker. There's been a number of questions from each of the from a number of the attendees regarding reference class forecasting, so I might summarise that into one question for all of the panellists at the end, if that's all right. So I'm going to hand over now to our next speaker, Graham, our final speaker for today, final speaker of 2020. Graham, just give us a quick mic check if you're there.
Hi, good morning, Wes.
Yep, can hear you loud and clear, so I should have just given you the power to present your screen.
Good stuff. That's great. Okay, thanks very much. It's a privilege to be.
Slides up, just Graham.
Yep.
I don't know whether it's just running a bit behind.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. Yeah, just can't see anything unless it's just me. Danielle, can you see any
No,
of the
I
slides?
can't see anything. You just need to.
There
Yeah.
we go. Perfect. Over to you then, Graham.
Okay, yep, all good. Yeah, thanks very much. So, yeah, it's quite a privilege to be the last speaker of 2020. Quite a year it's been, especially from a risk management perspective. So, the topic I'm going to be looking at today is Monte Carlo dead? So, quite a controversial question to be asking, but we'll go into it in a little bit more depth. So I'm going to be presenting an alternative approach to understanding, modelling and managing your risk. Okay, so very briefly, I'll give you an outline of our company and then a little bit about myself too, just before I get started. So Risk Control was set up back in 2018 with the objective of tackling subjectivity, interdependency and complexity in risk management. So we use a patented modelling technique in our software to manage risk across extended enterprises, major infrastructure projects, business continuity and crisis management frameworks and supply chains. So a little bit about myself. So my name is Graham Miller. I'm a fellow of the Institute. In terms of kind of educational background, I did a master's in risk management and I did the IRM's international diploma as well. So I've gained my experience across major infrastructure projects, including HS2, Crossrail 2 and London Underground station upgrade projects. So just a little bit of a disclaimer here. So I'm a risk manager, I'm pure risk. I'm not a mathematician. So with that in mind, you can imagine my horror when I started to research the underlying principles behind this technique that I'm going to be presenting on. I mean, this kind of thing's quite scary for anybody to see, so you'll be assured to know that I'm not going to go into this in very much detail. But if anybody does want to know more about it, happy to have a conversation after the session and possibly put you in touch with one of the tech guys who might know a bit more. Okay, so I like to start my presentations with a bit of a quote usually, and I've been getting into philosophy a wee bit in my spare time recently, the geek that I am. So this one I thought was quite fitting to the subjects we're going to be looking at. So everything we hear is an opinion and it's not a fact. Everything we see is perspective and not the truth. So that seemed a pretty cool quote. It fits well, but having read Marcus Aurelius's books, it didn't ring any bells. It didn't really seem like the kind of thing that he would say. And sure enough, I stuck it into Google and there was another version of it, an earlier translation from a Greek interpretation. Same guy. So the universe, mutation, life, opinion. So a bit more succinct. But as I say, I've read it myself. I've got it on my Kindle. So just out of interest, I did a search on the book itself. And I discovered that it didn't say that one either. What it actually said was, this world is mere change and this life, opinion. Same guy, same quote, interpreted in 3 different ways. So what's this got to do with risk management, other than the content and the irony inherent in it, that his quotation itself has been subject to opinion, subject to perspective and mutation? It's all down to subjectivity. So this is defined as the influence of personal beliefs or feelings rather than facts. And this can manifest itself through biases, shortcut decision-making, known as heuristics, undue confidence in your data sources, to name just 3 of many. So we make subjective assessments every day. We're conscious of it. We know we do it in our private lives and our professional lives. But few professions do it as much probably as risk managers. We're constantly using subjective assessments to establish risk probabilities, potential cost impacts, delays, reputational impacts, and then when we're developing our mitigation strategies, there's subjectivity at every step of that process. So as professionals, we try to be objective. We try to get both sides of the story as far as we can and remove ourselves from the situations where we can. But despite our best efforts, subjectivity is hidden in every risk register that we compile, and therefore in every Monte Carlo model that we build. Excuse me, just a noisy slurp with my coffee. So I'll use a really simple example, which was put forward by Daniel Kahneman, who's he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist and psychologist who's specialised in decision-making specifically. So Steve is shy. He likes to keep himself to himself. His house is always neat and tidy, typical of his needs for order, structure, and his attention to detail. So given the information that you've been provided with there, do you think he's more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? So most people, when asked this question, and I think they were asked on the street, they were kind of stopped, they weren't anticipating it. They responded that, yeah, he sounds to me like a librarian. But if you were to stop for a moment, give it a bit of thought and maybe ask a question and reply, you might find out and get to the core of the problem, that is, there are far more farmers in the world than there are librarians. So in all likelihood, Steve is a farmer, albeit a neat and tidy one. So just as an aside, there are some other really good examples that Daniel Kahneman came up with. There's one relating to cab drivers in New York. So you might assume that a cab driver wants to be out and about when it's raining, when there's loads of people suddenly needing a taxi, plenty more money to be made. But that assumption was disproved. They went into the field, they found out what the real stats were telling them. And it turns out that the taxi drivers prefer to go out and about when the weather's nice and everybody's kind of enjoying the sunshine. So it's little anomalies like that that are the subjectivities at the core of them, and we need to scrutinise those to make sure that we're identifying where we're making shortcuts in our thinking and discounting very important information that could influence our results. So the second point then, interdependency. So risk correlation in our language. If one risk changes, how will it affect others that are related to it? So it's a complicated task. So here's a very basic representation of a risk. So we've got our core risk description, we've got our probability coming into that, we've got our 3-point estimate. So already you've got two elements which are almost entirely subjective. But that's not quite what we're talking about here. We're talking about the correlation. So you look at the potential causes. There are numerous. There could be 1, 2, and 3. There could be many more. We record that in our risk registers ordinarily, but to what extent has that actually been factored into the models that we're building and therefore the outputs? Similarly, when you look at the consequences, they could be into they could number very high levels. And not only that, with each new consequence, it effectively translates into a new cause and therefore into a new risk, which could breed further risk. So you can see then that very quickly the risk multiplies, the complexity graduates over and over, and before you know it, you've got something very, very complicated indeed to try and manage. So this is just a standard graphical representation of complexity. These nodes here could be any, you could apply anything to them. So for our purposes, they're risks, but they could be world cities, they could be planes in the sky. So this is a representation of what we know. But what about the unknown knowns? What about the unknown unknowns? As we can all remember, I'm sure, from Donald Rumsfeld's less than coherent speech. So there's a whole lot of stuff we don't know about. How do we capture that? How do we capture the uncertainty that's in the structure of our complex infrastructure projects? So Our approach is three-pronged. It's a blend of three existing modelling approaches which complement each other. So the first element here is Bayesian networks. Now, I'm sure that Andy mentioned Bayesian briefly earlier on. So this is not the only element that we're using here. It's as I say, a blend. But just to give you an overview of what it does, it's a probabilistic model that represents a set of variables and their conditional dependencies. So effectively, it's modelling complexity. It's modelling the correlation between the inputs, in our case, risks. So they're ideal for taking an event that's already occurred and predicting the likelihood that one of several possible causes was the contributing factor. So you can already see this is potentially a lot of value for risk managers. You're getting to the very root cause of what's causing your risk, and you're getting a probabilistic representation of which is most likely to have been your actual cause. So, for example, a Bayesian network could represent a probabilistic relationship between diseases and symptoms, and then be used to compute probabilities of the presence of various diseases. So in our world, then that would accurately pinpoint causes, as I kind of touched on there, and highlight which is your most likely culprit, what's driving your results. So that's the first element. The second element that we use in our modelling technique is subjective logic. So this takes uncertainty and sources of your data sources into account. How much trust do you hold in your input data? And then it uses mathematics to express opinion in the model. So this is subjective opinion being converted into a usable input in a mathematical model. So it's hugely valuable. It's capturing a great deal of subjective stuff that is often only recorded if it is recorded at all, but doesn't actually contribute to what your exposure is. So you're starting to see now that we're opening up the net a lot further than what's commonly done in major infrastructure projects. So just briefly as well, there's a representation of the kind of structure we're talking about on the right-hand side there. So that is showing you the interdependency between the elements, how there are grandparent risks, child risks, parent risks. So all the various elements are mapped and their correlation is accurately recorded. So in general, the subjective logic element, it's suitable for modelling and analysing situations involving uncertainty and relatively unreliable sources. So Andy made a good point. If you can't justify what's in there, it often gets left out. This component of the modelling technique answers that question, it helps towards the resolution of that problem. We can identify something that we don't know, we're not entirely sure about. There's uncertainty around it. The sources are questionable. So you can understand then this is why this technique is used in the analysis of intelligence data. Often the sources are very unreliable. There's a lot of uncertainty around them. So that's where this modelling technique originates. It comes from the intelligence industry or arena, I suppose. So again, this component you can see is potential huge benefit in risk management. So then the third component is effectively adding an additional component and utilising the subjective logic element as well. So what this does is allows for the integration of empirical and statistical data, and then allows you to take account of judgments made by human beings. So that's the subjective logic element, the transferring of opinion into mathematical elements. So yeah, that can be used to generate possible outcomes, courses of actions. So you can see where this might start to be really useful in risk management. Designed for strategic and tactical intelligence analysis and law enforcement investigations. So it's tried and trusted in very high risk environments where the risks are really are life and death. It shows then the power of it and the strength of it, how robust the analyses are. So it dramatically reduces the cognitive load of analysts or risk managers in our instance, allowing us to focus more on the judgments that you do make independently, and to interpret those better also. Okay, just a random little sentence, don't know how that happens. So our software then, so we've taken all this power and we've repurposed it. So we've recognised the potential application of it to risk management situations. So not just in major infrastructure projects across entire enterprises and their extended networks, supply chains. And the reason that it's so widely applicable and scalable is that every risk is essentially a model in its own right. So then you've got all these modular elements that can be connected into a model for an individual project, scaled up to a program, scaled up to a portfolio, all the way up to an entire enterprise, including its extended partners and its supply chain. So it's got a great deal of a really broad application. Okay, so the top point then, combined models. It doesn't just look at cost, it looks at schedule as well. And I refer briefly back to the kind of route structure that we saw a couple of slides ago. Effectively, one branch would be cost, one branch would be schedule, and then it increases and increases level by level the amount of data that's been input. So the result of that means that you can isolate cost, what's our cost exposure, and it gives you an assessment as to your expected cost exposure and then your confidence in that assessment, which can then be drilled down upon, so you can figure out, well, where are we lacking confidence? How can we improve that level of confidence? Similarly, on the other side of the tree, the route structure, you've got your schedule, and it's exactly the same process that we're using there. We're applying exactly the same level of rigor, regardless of whether you're talking about a risk in a work package or whether you're talking about your highest value strategic risk. So all risks are correlated. Effectively, as I've just kind of alluded to, it's all joined up. So you have the potential to have every one of your models tying into the level above it, until you've got your whole organization mapped with one network. So you can therefore look at your entire exposure, appreciate the correlation that cascades across your whole organization, and understand exactly where it's originating. So every individual risk is fully understood to a degree that has never been done before. You're taking an assessment of your data sources, and you're looking at the effectiveness of mitigation. So not only are you including your causes in the analysis, you're also assessing your mitigation strategies. How likely is this mitigation to succeed? How much of an effect would it have in lowering your exposure? And subsequently, what level of effort should we be applying to achieving that? When we're talking about schedule, we're looking at linkages between critical activities, which are identified and modelled. So this is, again, the effects of correlation being accurately mapped across your entire schedule. The next point then is related to hypothetical scenario models. So this was especially useful in the intelligence analysis area. They had to know from the get-go, if we do this, is what's going to happen. If we take this course of action, what's going to happen? And as I said, the risks couldn't be any higher. We can use that technique to develop highly realistic hypothetical scenario models to assess different options. For example, we can say, we need to deliver a portfolio of projects. Which of them should we deliver, given we can't afford to do them all? So you build a model effectively for each of the options, and it'll tell you the pros and cons, and actually offer up suggestions as to how you should proceed based on levels of confidence. And the next point is external systems. So this can be linked to all your existing systems. It's compatible with all industry APIs. So if you're already using databases, tie it into this, and there's the option to automate updates. So this is a really powerful element. This can remove a lot of the workload from the guys on the ground, the risk managers who are doing the day-to-day management of risk. So a good example, I think, is where you have specific site costs. So when we're quantifying our total exposure, we want to know what's the cost of the schedule side of the tree. So the way that we would do that is to consider the elements that make up the cost. So you've got prolongation costs are generally made up by site prelims and resource costs. Generally, that's the extent of them, but they're fluctuating on a month-to-month basis. So we don't want a risk manager having to go around every month and saying, right, have your costs changed? Have you let some people go? Have you taken on extra resource? Have you get rid of some of the site setup? They'll have all that in their own systems. Tie that into your risk register, and that's updated whenever their system's updated. You've got that in every one of your sites. This is just one example. Another one might be when you're set a benchmark. If your probability increases above 70%, automatically generate an early warning notice related to that specific risk. So the owner could get pinged on his mobile or her mobile. One of your risks is increased in probability, and there's an EWN been raised as a result. So you can imagine how many applications this functionality has on major infrastructure projects and beyond. And the final point, it's a big one, time-stamped reports with every change in the model. So this is increasing transparency, auditability, and traceability of risk movements to a level we haven't seen before. It means that there's no more ambiguity as to what is driving your risk exposure. There's no more kind of smoke and mirrors around what's making up your what's changed and why. I mean, I've been in situations where I've spent weeks building a complex model, a Monte Carlo model. I've put it all together. I've tried to make sure the data is as robust as possible, shown it to a senior commercial guy, and he said, that's too high, go and do something with it. That undermines the work that we do. We work really hard. We try and work with integrity and professionalism. So that kind of massaging of the numbers will be removed by this transparency. You can't change something without it being justified, and in many cases it's automated. So it's far more robust data going in. So it's like the garbage in, garbage out analogy that was used earlier. If we're confident in the stuff that's going in, we're confident in the way that the model's working, then we can be confident in the results, and you need to buy into the results if you buy into the rest of the process. So making things a lot more clearer, making everybody a lot more aware. Okay, so back to the original question then. Is Monte Carlo dead? Probably not. So what we've heard from the other guys is presenting on today's call, it is a really useful tool. If in the right hands and used effectively, it has a lot of benefits to it. But it's complicated. To get the very best, the best out of it, you need to spend a lot of time, and you need to have quite a lot of specialist knowledge, which a lot of people don't have that level of expertise. So while it may not be dead, there's finally a viable alternative to it that we can start to get excited about, I think. So that's me, all done. Thanks for listening. If you've got any questions or you'd like to get in touch to find out more about any of it, my details are there. They'll be in the slide pack afterwards.
Thanks ever so much, Graham. Really Appreciate that. So the astute among you will have noticed that we've overrun our time slot by about 7 minutes, which, considering the subject matter today, is probably a little embarrassing. But what we'll look to do is close out by about 11:15. So if you're able to stay on for the next 8 or 9 minutes, what I'll do, I'll ask one question of yourself direct, if I can, Graham, and then I'll have one last overarching question for all of our panelists. So Graham, the question that's come in for you, which I think we want to ask, is that these techniques that you've talked about seem to imply additional input would be required from project teams during workshops or during information gathering stage. In your experience, can this be practically achieved?
Yes, very much so. It's not more laborious in terms of you're not gathering more data, you're just using the data that you already gather more intelligently. So we've got all the cause information, we've got all the consequence information. The only difference is we don't normally use that. We don't apply likelihoods and uncertainty around each of the causes currently, or indeed with any of the mitigation strategies. So it's just using what we've already got. So we've got a little tagline: we're not reinventing the wheel, we're replacing the engine. I think that's kind of what we're trying to do with it. Take what you're used to and use it to better results.
Perfect, thank you. There's been so many questions coming in. We're not going to have any chance of asking all these questions. What Danielle and I are going to do is probably start a bit of a conversation on LinkedIn, and we'll also gather all these questions up and hopefully just provide a bit of an output if the speakers wouldn't mind giving us a bit more of their spare time. After this, there's been a number of questions specifically about reference class forecasting across all 4 of the presentations and how that feeds into the output. So I think that'll be a really good subject for us to tackle. So one final question then for all 4 of our panelists, if I may, before I hand back to Danielle to close us out for 2020. So a lot of comments have been made throughout the presentations about the quality of inputs, the quality of the data, regarding garbage in, garbage out. Matt, I think you coined it in one of your slides that risks in a project environment, for example, are assessed in the context in which they are identified. So again, it all comes down to data quality for our outputs to be taken seriously. So what do we as risk management professionals need to do or change to improve the use of our outputs in decision making? So open floor, whoever one of our panelists wants to chip in first.
Yeah, I might take this one, Wes.
Yeah, crack on.
Yeah, I think we need to understand we need to assess our assessments effectively. We need to look at our sources of data and assess how confident we are in them. We need to highlight where there's subjectivity, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Gut feeling is a valuable resource. I mean, if you've got a 30-year experienced tunneling engineer and he thinks that a risk could go this way, then we don't want to discard that entirely. We want to say, this is the opinion of such and such. It's a subjective opinion. It is based on his experience, it's expertise, and then say, do we have any support and documentation, any evidence to make this a more robust assessment? So by applying that kind of level of rigour, without it being more onerous than what we currently do, I think we can get a lot more out of the guys on the teams.
Great stuff, thank you. I'm going to ask Andrew to chip in as well if he's got a response to that. I'm conscious that, Andrew, you need to drop off in a few minutes.
No worries. Yeah, so I mean, very, very interesting question. We've always struggled with data quality. People are often in a rush to get things together. They have other priorities, and frankly, they're usually doing the best they can in the time available. But as risk analysts and risk support to them, I think we get to know that there are more. There's no one sort of silver bullet to it. It's a number of different areas. Good workshop process, good sort of explanation to them over the potential for extremes, trying to encourage people to think about their experiences in the past and what's actually happened, rather than just looking at the internal view that they have on the project ahead of them. And then when it comes to aggregating those results, sort of trying to encourage multiple perspectives to come together on a particular risk, and then trying to balance those assessments together. you have to be really careful, because sometimes the top down view, they might want a slightly different view. So you have to really sort of make sure you're balancing different legitimate views to get as best accuracy as possible. And finally, you just have to be aware that they're only going to be able to go so far. So you're going to have to recognise there is a limitation to what we put together in the end, and be transparent about that.
Thanks, Andrew. Doug, any comments, or Matt?
I mean, personally, I'm obviously a big fan of sensitivity analysis, but if we're talking about QRA, I'd love to see clients make conscious choices about what distribution to use. For me, too many models are really set up as templates where everything is assumed to be triangular, and people just need to give a minimum, most likely, and a maximum value. And of course, if you look at choosing a distribution in a tool like At-Risk, there's an overwhelming choice of maybe 70 distributions. And as Graham said, I'm sure that most people on here are risk managers, not mathematicians. But for me, if you're building a model, or you're using a model, and all you're using is triangular distributions or even PERT distributions, then I think it's also worth investigating or understanding log normal, trigen, and uniform distributions as well, to make sure that you choose the one that's the best fit for your input. And I think that conscious thought process of choosing the right distribution, I think that really can feed into making sure that the data is also more valid as well.
Great stuff. Thanks, Doug. And then Matt, do you want final points?
Yeah, absolutely. Really insightful and interesting question, and a really big challenge. I think a lot of people recognise. Certainly from my perspective, and what we try and do in Optimise is first of all, when we're training associates and risk team members, we work on the foundations first, and we build them up to a level where they're confident enough to make those really difficult challenges. I'm sure a lot of risk professionals will probably resonate with the comment that you can sometimes be in a room and there's a big elephant in the room and no one wants to pull it out, and just being confident enough to be able to say, what's that over there, what is it? You know, pull it out, get to the underpinning data, get to a position where you've got consensus in the context that you're in, and then send it wide. You know, organizations are made of individuals that have got decades of experience, but when you surmise all that up, you're getting hundreds of years, if not thousands of years worth of insight and knowledge and optimism. And the wider that you send it up into the organization, up into the management teams, up into your accountable areas, the more buy-in you'll get to the data, the more challenge you'll get to the data, and hopefully it'll get to a point where, if people all, you know, to Graham's earlier point, which is a really valid point, if you get that people buying into the inputs, then they have to buy into the outputs as a matter of the process. If the models run correctly and if QSRA systems are built correctly, then the outputs will be correct versus the inputs. But I think it's a combination of getting our risk professionals, getting our risk teams to challenge, to not be afraid to challenge, to ask those difficult questions, get the data as robust as possible on the ground, and then fire it out for comment and try and get that feedback and incorporate that back in as an input.
Great stuff. Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to close it there. There's a significant number of questions, a significant number of people saying how much they enjoyed it and how much they appreciated the content of the slides. So like I said, we'll take all the questions that haven't been answered and we'll try and get some responses from the speakers. But for now, I'll hand over to Danielle to close us out.
Thanks, Wes, and thanks to all of our